Hello, everyone. I'm Ken Folven, Senior Director of Quality Assurance with Clear Capital. Well, we've received some really great feedback on this webinar series, An Appraiser's Guide to Quality Appraisals. And today's webinar is our final webinar from our four-part series and is focused on how to avoid revision requests on FHA loans and tips on minimizing reconsideration of value requests. So in this webinar, we're going to cover the top FHA revision requests we see from lenders. Then we're going to provide some guidance for everyone on how to avoid those and share some best practices as it relates to reconsideration of value requests and give you some tips on how you can help minimize those. And presenting with me today is Todd Ewert, trainer of the Quality Assurance team for Clear Capital.
Hello, everybody. Ken, great to be joining you here in Minnesota.
Yes, looking forward to the topic. All right, so first, we just want to kick us off with some of the benefits of this webinar series. And for some of you who have listened to the prior webinars, this is similar, but I really want to highlight the benefits that we're trying to accomplish with this. And the first is that we want to help you as appraisers stay connected. And we know that if you're not working in an office full of appraisers, it can be challenging at times to stay connected in the industry with what's going on with customer changes, particularly over the past few years. We also know your time is valuable. We want to help you receive the fewest revision requests as possible. So we want to share that information with you. Also want to make sure everyone's aware of the consequences of the delays that a revision request can have on the process. So obviously these requests not only impact your time, but they have downstream impacts for the AMC, the lender, and then ultimately the borrower is the one who we're trying to avoid those for. And then last but not least is improve the credibility of your report and trust in the profession. As appraisers, we have a responsibility to promote the public trust. And as our industry continues to change, we need to show the value and the reliability in the appraisal process. All right, so as I mentioned, today is our fourth and final webinar series. So we've completed 3 previous versions on different topics, and we've had a lot of success and high participation rates on those. So knowing that this is our fourth and final, if you have any suggestions for future webinar topics, feel free to drop those suggestions in the chat. We'll capture those, and we can certainly consider that for future content. We're always happy to hear from you and keep pushing out content and information that you would find helpful. So let us know. All right, then let's jump into it. Here's the most common FHA revision categories we see across all lenders we work with at Clear Capital. And I'm going to turn it over to Todd, our resident expert here, to kick off some helpful tips and insights into these specific categories and give some guidance on how you can avoid those. So Todd, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. So the list of categories that we're going to go over today: FHA commentary, externalities, missing photos, deferred maintenance, and as is and subject to requirements. So I'll go ahead and get on to the next slide here. FHA commentary. So this, of course, is not a complete list of FHA required statements, but we do want to share with you the ones that we see are omitted or incorrect the most often. So we'll begin with public water and sewer. If a subject property is on private utilities, the lender is always going to want to know whether public utilities are available. Now, if the answer is no, that pretty much solves that problem. But if the answer is yes, there's going to be a follow-up question, which is, are public utilities available? And is it economically feasible for the subject property to hook up to them? Now, the expectation is not, of course, that suddenly appraisers become experts in the cost to hook up to utilities, but as much information as can be provided would really help that reviewer or underwriter make that lending decision. So for example, if it is known that the hookup is a quarter mile away, or if the local utility could be contacted for an estimate, anything that can be provided at all is going to be super helpful for that person behind the desk to make a decision as to how to proceed. Lenders do see it as the appraisers are the eyes and ears out there in the field. So just any information that can be provided and any diligence completed to answer that question is going to help avoid that revision request. At number 2, we've got the intended user statement, either incorrect or missing. Of course, FHA and the mortgagee are the intended users of the report. So it's highly recommended that if you have a template specifically set aside for FHA reports, that you contain that statement within the template. We've also seen several revisions for appraisers completing USDA reports where it appears that perhaps the FHA template is also being used for their USDA reports, and the intended user statement is not being changed from USDA to FHA. So a reminder there to go ahead and change that intended user or have a new template for USDA files. Now, finally, everyone is familiar with the attic and crawl space requirement, but we have seen a lot of revisions for the comment no access because of its lack of specificity. In fact, there are 4 circumstances that I've come across that might qualify as no access. The first one, personal property, would be a subject to condition. Right? The expectation would be that that personal property would be removed so the appraiser could get access to the attic or crawl space. These next 3, in and of themselves, can remain as is conditions with a photograph of whatever the appraiser can take a photograph of to tell the story. The last 3 are there's a permanent obstruction in the way, for example, a deck built over a crawl space, and access flat out does not exist, in which case you want to include very specific commentary that it does not exist. Or a circumstance is too dangerous, like a volume ceiling is the attic access. And even if the appraiser had a magic ladder in their trunk that was long enough, they wouldn't dream of climbing up there. These other 3 circumstances are examples of no access, but we've seen an unfortunate number of appraisals come back because of the lack of specificity as to why there was not access.
Yeah, good information there, Todd. I think maybe one thing just to add on with that is hopefully that those are noted as exceptions in terms of not having access to that attic or crawl space and not the norm. So I think most lenders and FHA would require that the appraiser, does have that and completes that part of the inspection, but it's good to point out here that there are some reasonable circumstances in which the appraiser can't have access, what those are. So thanks for sharing that.
That's a great point, and don't forget your flashlight. External influences are our next topic, and although this is not specific to FHA, it still does come up very, very often with FHA reports. Just like conventional loans, when there is some type of external influence, either positive or negative, but particularly negative, as we can see here, busy road, railroad tracks, commercial influences, place of warships, and schools. I would add to that more distant influences like airports and landfills. Just keep in mind that the lender is very likely using aerial images and street images, the same ones that you and I have access to. And anything that might appear to be an externality, be it a double yellow line on the subject street or a house of worship down the street, even though house of worships may be very common in a particular area, it does represent a potential lending risk. And so providing commentary, providing a comp with a similar influence, and where some risk could be perceived is if that comp with the similar influence doesn't support the value conclusion, the potential risk to the lender is that the full market reaction for that influence has possibly not been accounted for. So just something to keep in mind when bracketing that feature, paying attention to any difference that might exist between that adjusted value and your value conclusion. Going back in time, of course, is a great tool to go back and bracket any feature, particularly an externality. As I like to say, at least in my experience, a diligent search in the lending world really begins at 24 months. 36 months is entirely acceptable. And even if you must go back up to 5 years to show that the market is willing to accept that feature, in the lending world, it is perfectly acceptable because, again, it supports the marketability and just supports the market's willingness. Although it might not seem like a big deal to have a school down the street, might even seem like a benefit. But what the lender needs to support is that the market is willing to purchase property that does have that externality.
Yeah, I love the idea there, Todd, of going back in time. I think a lot of appraisers are skeptical of going beyond a year for a comparable, and sharing that going back beyond 12 months up to 5 years, as you pointed out, is important to try to demonstrate that marketability if the subject has one of these influences.
Yeah, 12 months really does seem to be a barrier for some. I know that it was a Fannie Mae kind of commentary check mark. If you have to go back past 12 months, please let us know why. But I think it's interpreted as a barrier oftentimes. And especially, you know, we've seen changing market conditions in so many markets that there's a real reluctance to go back. But regardless of what adjustment that might apply, as long as the adjustment is supported, again, it supports the market's historical willingness to accept that factor, which is critical to collateral lending.
Yep.
All right, well, moving on to photo requirements. There is our friend attic and crawl space photo. Unfortunately, it's frequently missing, but it is an FHA requirement, as are original comparable photos. And I think important to keep in mind, if an original comparable photo is taken, but the improvements are less than, if I had to put a number on it, maybe about 75% visible, consider going ahead and including an MLS photo as well as your original photo, just to make sure that the improvements are visible. In addition to that, all bathroom photos, of course, are required for all conventional and FHA assignments, but FHA also requires all bedroom photos, not just a representation. That's okay for conventional, but FHA requires all bedrooms. And for that matter, really any interior photo. While we're on the subject, any photo of, even if it's the inside of a garage, I have seen a revision request for an inside of garage photo, anything that contributes value to the subject property. Make sure you get a photo of it as long as you're out there. FHA does have a tendency to be more sensitive in their photo requirements, might ask you for a little more. So when in doubt, go ahead and get that photo. As well, make sure there's a photo of all outbuildings and I won't call this a frequent revision request, but I have seen it on numerous occasions, and it's maybe not as well known an FHA requirement. And that is that the street scene must include the subject site in the photo. It must be discernible that the subject site is visible in that photo. So either by comparison with the street scene photo, maybe the mailbox looks the same and you can see the subject's mailbox, or by adding maybe an arrow pointing to the subject site. But the subject's site does need to be visible in that photo.
Yeah, good ones there, Todd. Another one that comes up kind of frequently that's not specifically called out there, but it relates to photos, is not having evidence or having photographed all sides of the subject property. So that's kind of another one of those that doesn't come up a lot, but it certainly can cause some pain for the appraiser if they have to go back out and photograph the left rear side of the subject property because it wasn't included originally. So
nothing worse than having to go back in the field for sure. And those side photos can be taken in as few or as many photos as it takes. You can get the front left and the back right in 2 photos, and if they're all visible, then that's great. Sometimes it requires some extra though, but that's a great point. Yeah, no one likes going back out in the field. Getting into FHA repair criteria. Now, in Handbook 4000.1, repair requirements are noted as being FHA limited required repairs. I consider this, Ken, and you can let me know if you agree or not. The requirements for repairs are not so drastically different from conventional loans. It's just the sensitivity in these particular areas tends to be turned up a little bit. The 3 areas of limited required repairs are, number 1, those that maintain the safety, security, and soundness of the property. Number 2, that preserve the continued marketability, and we'll clarify what that means. And number 3, protect the health and safety of the occupants. Now, some examples of these, of course, safety and security, severe structural issues, foundational issues, loose electrical wiring, anything that compromises security or soundness. Preserving the continued marketability. Now, FHA is very sensitive to condition in that they want to ensure the improvements have the best chance of lasting as long as the loan duration. And so you can, the most common, to give an example, the most commonly requested repair item is peeling paint. And even if a paint is worn off of an exterior concrete surface that was formerly painted, that will need to be painted as well. So you can think of whatever it takes to put a kind of protective shell around the subject property to preserve the continued marketability, to prevent deterioration from happening faster than it normally would, to make sure the subject lasts as long as that loan. And finally, protecting the health and safety of occupants. There's some overlap there with number 1, of course, but we can frame this as enabling the continued functionality of a safe home, meaning functioning heat, the ability to cook, restroom facilities, those things that are all necessary for functional daily life within the subject property. Now, there is a list in 4000.1 of allowable conditions. Here's a small sample here. Missing handrails, for example, are permissible as long as safety is not compromised. Defective interior paint and other interior cosmetic deficiencies are as long, and defect by interior paint, of course, as long as it's non-lead based paint. Imperfections like that are permitted. And finally, minor plumbing leaks are acceptable as well. There's a big difference between a shower drain dripping in the middle of a crawl space and standing water up against the foundation. Now, the latter, of course, would be a preservation and continued marketability issue. But the former, a minor plumbing leak, whether it's under the sink or dripping under the foundation, are perfectly acceptable. So we do see some revisions for subject to requirements that are not necessary, as well as some that are missing. What do you think, Ken? Did we cover that pretty well?
Yeah, I think you covered the repair items very thoroughly. You got it.
Good. All right. Well, on the subject of deferred maintenance, when reporting deferred maintenance, it's important to keep in mind these 4 steps, right? A photo of the item, a comment as to whether or not, if it's not clear whether or not health and safety are impacted or whether it's a cosmetic issue. Providing a cost to cure, especially for those items that are left as is that are not necessary repairs, and any impact on value. So those last 2 primarily refer to those repairs, deferred maintenance items that are allowable as is. What is the cost to cure? And what is the overall impact on the condition rating and the overall impact on value? But either honestly for conventional or for FHA assignments, if appraisers kind of follow those 4 steps when reporting deferred maintenance, you can eliminate a lot of revision requests. And as a bonus here, I threw in, excuse me, one required comment that is sometimes left out is whether or not the subject meets or will meet all minimum property requirements, either currently meets in its as-is state or will meet once all the subject to conditions are completed.
Yeah, that's a good one to call out, Todd. I think oftentimes on those subject to reports, we see appraisal reports that don't bring up that the subject property will meet those minimum property requirements. So keeping that in mind, knowing that the statement is required in both situations, it's just a slight change to what you're notating there.
Well, I think that about wraps up our FHA top revisions. We're going to switch gears here and I believe move on to reconsiderations of value.
Yeah, good job on, I would say covering those FHA items. I think if everyone hopefully can take note of some of those most common revisions that we see, all of which, overall are pretty easily avoidable. Just spending a little bit of extra time during your submission process or while you're out at the inspection, they're pretty easy, simple revision requests that can be remediated just with a little bit of extra time on the front end. And that will definitely save you and everyone else quite a bit of time on the back end. So hopefully you guys found that helpful. So let's move on to another important topic, the reconsideration of value requests.
Yeah, very important topic. I'm sure there's a lot of interest in this. And this is a topic we've got about, just checking the time here, about 10 minutes left in our presentation. This is certainly one that we could spend all day talking about, but we'll try to go through it as quickly and meaningfully as possible. Now, reconsiderations of value are typically accompanied by sales sent for consideration. Now, in our research, we have found that the vast majority of sales that are sent for consideration are sent because they are more proximate to the subject than sales that are used in the appraisal report. So whether or not those sales that are sent are priced lower or priced higher, or have potentially other imperfections, such as maybe a little smaller or a little larger, or maybe a little more dated than the appraiser might prefer, typically the point of sending sales is an effort to capture location, right? And according to Fannie Mae, of all of the elements of comparison. If we were to, we judge our comparable selection by being close, current, or conforming. In the eyes of Fannie Mae, and certainly location probably edges out the other two in terms of its overall contribution to value, just because so many things are baked into location that are so difficult to extract. And so what I recommend is doing something that I call anchoring the analysis, making sure that proximity is represented in the appraisal report. Now, in order to do this, it might mean selecting a comparable that is a little bigger or a little smaller or a little more dated than an appraiser might care for. But if after making the adjustment for those, if it's necessary to do so, when holding up the approximate sale against a more distant sale, it really does, if they're adjusting out at similar levels, it really does support similar market appeal, similar marketability between the proximate area and the more distant area. And the risk that appraisers run when they go distant first is you might just be telling the reader what the property is worth over there as opposed to where it sits. And so sacrificing an element of comparison somewhat in order to pick up those elements of comparison that reside above the GLA line in the top half of the grid is not only an excellent way to mitigate risk, it's an excellent way to support value and support compatibility between varying market areas. That kind of speaks to viewing sales as data points as opposed to replacement properties. Replacement properties are the ideal, of course, but in the absence of replacement properties, having those data points, which after adjusted can demonstrate differences or similarities in marketability between different areas, is critical. And it's a key part of collateral underwriting. Now, moving on to the reconciliation. The more complex the assignment, I would argue that the weighted average reconciliation, which is a very, very common popular technique, software can now generate a value conclusion based on your gross adjustments. And we can spend a day talking about this, but I'll try to summarize very quickly and say that by nature, complex properties are the reason why something might be complex is that there's a lack of replacement, right? So we're now looking at data points instead of replacement properties. It means there's going to be differences between those properties that are going to be difficult to extract adjustments for. In fact, no appraiser wants to make an adjustment that they can't support. So these wide ranges of value, I tend to believe, are due to differences in market preference, even though we can't really quantify them. That's when an excellent reconciliation can come in and make up the difference for the inability to adjust for differences, right? So that lack of data can really be made up for with an excellent reconciliation, a discussion of characteristics that impact value. And where the weighted average reconciliation, I think, has its downside is its lack of specificity in the way that it discusses the value driving components of the subject property. And the second point here, I think, kind of summarizes it. Does the commentary reflect the complexity of the assignment? Does a weighted average really speak to the nuance of the property that you're appraising? Now, oftentimes weighted averages will result in what I like to call a floating value. And I'd like to challenge our appraiser friends out there. The next time you use a weighted average technique, go ahead and just for fun, see what the straight average of your comparables is, and then compare that to your weighted average and see if it's really much different. Most of the time, it's really not. Now, a floating value may seem safe. It's not too high. It's not too small. It's kind of safely in the middle there. But that is viewed as a potential collateral risk by lenders because the value is not necessarily tied to any specific value driving characteristics. It's just kind of an average of all the comparables in the report. So the more specific and knowledgeable, the more you can show off your knowledge of, in this market, buyers are paying for X, and therefore I'm going to associate my value most closely with this comparable that has X. That makes for a very meaningful and convincing discussion, more so, I think, than the weighted average in a complex assignment, at least. And then finally, reviewing sales, we talked about this a bit. Sales are often sent because they are more proximate. Now, whether you use the sales, of course, is up to the appraiser, but address the substance of the request. Address the difference. If you want to reject a sale because it is too small or too big or too dated, that's perfectly fine. But if you could include in your conversation weighing those differences against the similarity of being proximate to the subject, because remember, that's the whole point, that the sale is being sent. So if there is a reason disclosed for sending that sale, address the reason and address the substance. And of course, lastly, Ken, something that I suggest to appraisers whenever I have conversations with them, we can't certainly talk about every single data point that exists in the market. But if there is a sale that you came across that you considered that almost made the cut but didn't quite, and so you left it out of the grid, I like to say never waste your diligence. So go ahead and have an addendum section called sales considered but not used. And you could very well be heading off a potential revision request if, of course, AMCs and lenders all have access to their own data sources and may come across a sale that may look attractive, may look similar, may want to get your take on it. If you can beat them to the punch, you can avoid that revision request with considered but not used. So I feel like I just did a lot of talking there. Ken, is there anything that you want to follow up with?
No, you did a good job there, Todd, touching on things. I would say, in my experience, that reconciliation piece is a big one, talking about why you use the sales that you used. And that helps the reader of the report understand why you've selected sales with certain dominant features or whatnot that are similar to the subject. And by providing the why on why you selected those sales and why you're weighting certain sales, that can, call it, proactively answer questions from the lender around some potential other sales. They may not send you then certain sales down the road during a reconsideration of value because it does not have one of those dominant features that you've already talked about. So I think that reconciliation piece there is a key to minimizing some of these reconsideration of value requests.
Agreed.
All right. So our next slide here, as we wrap up, we've got a couple minutes that just want to emphasize here some key points when responding to these reconsideration of value requests and some best practices. So it's really important for all of us as appraisers to just remember and know about the importance these types of requests have on the process. And it may not be clear to you. It may be clear, to you why you didn't use a certain sale, but the intended user may not have that same level of awareness. So therefore, you could receive a reconsideration of value request or an additional sale. So use it as an opportunity really to evaluate your report. You've already submitted the report one time, it's gone through, the lender has it. Now you're getting an opportunity to reevaluate your report based on some additional criteria that is being sent over. So look at that objectively, but really take the time and allow yourself time to evaluate your report, your comp selection, and your value conclusion. And if changes need to be made, that's the time to make those changes, whether it impacts your value or not. That's up for you to make that determination, but take advantage of the opportunity to revisit your report. Just some quick tips when responding to these reconsideration of value requests. The first is professionally. As Todd talked about, and I've touched on a little bit, the request may reflect the lender's efforts to serve their borrower. So a borrower may be wanting to know why the sale next door in the neighborhood wasn't used in your analysis. So again, although it may be clear to you, the intended user, the borrower, they may not be aware. So take a look, respond professionally. Also be sure that you respond objectively to these requests. I wouldn't say it's common, but it's certainly been seen, some emotionally charged responses in addendums from appraisers, and that really detracts from the credibility of the analysis when you show your emotion in your response. So regardless if you think the sale is valid or not, or when you're responding to any of these, really just make sure that you're taking out any emotions from your responses that go in your addendums. And then be sure to completely respond. Make sure that your responses are consistent with the commentary you already have in your appraisal report. All right. And that's a quick 30 minutes, Todd.
That flew by. That absolutely flew by. And Ken, I know we're limited on time here, but just to piggyback what you said, and I really like that last slide. A lot of times appraisers feel like their appraisal report is the only outlet that they have to express themselves. But as Ken mentioned, emotionally charged language, it only detracts from your expertise and from your hard work. we're here to help. And so rather than put those types of things in an appraisal report, pick up the phone. And if you need someone to vent to, we're here for you, right? We've got a lot of staff appraisers and senior staff appraisers on staff that have been in that situation too. And we're happy to talk the problem out with you and partner with you to try to clear it off your desk in the easiest way possible.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. All right, just to wrap things up then, if you're not currently on our panel and are interested in joining, we have some information here for you to learn more. As in all of our webinars, we've tried providing a few relevant industry links, so familiarize yourself with these if you're not already. We'd like to thank you for joining us today, and hopefully you found this helpful. So be sure to send us any future webinar content topics if you have any. But thanks for joining us today.
For sure. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.